This is purely internal domestic matter of a country. Now, what right another institution has to say, oh, you have done this, why did you do it? This is why I say the report we don't accept, we will battle on, we will indicate our concern logically with facts, factual errors, errors in law, errors in perception. These are the three areas that we are writing our reports. We are not ready to surrender without a fight.
We're heading into difficult times or choppy waters, but we're not willing to surrender.
No, I'm a
without
sailor.
fight. Yes.
Calm waters will never make a good sailor. We want to continue with the Office of Missing Person. We want to continue with the Office of Reparation. We want to continue with all human rights institutions in the country. Not only continue, we want to empower them. We want to give them funding. We want to make appointments to various positions. Now we have asked their action plan for 2021. Okay, what is your action plan? So we really want these institutions to function. We were at a war. We were at a conflict. We were at a violent armed conflict. In a conflict, people died. But if 70,000 people died in the last phases of the war, where are the bodies? Where are the skeletons? None. Now, what is wrong with the senior retired military officer being appointed to perform another function? Look at the COVID handling. Do you think if not for the army involvement, the Sri Lanka would be within the first 10 best countries of handling COVID? No way. Unconstitutional. So we can't do it. We can't have foreign judges in Sri Lanka, judging us.
Admiral Columbage, thank you very much for joining us. My first question is one of the hottest topics in the country right now, the upcoming UNHRC sessions, which will be held in Geneva next month, the 46th session, I think. Now, you were appointed to the role last year. I think it was August 2020. This is almost a year after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa became president. What I would like to know is, besides all of this, for a long time, you have anyway been President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's sort of foreign advisor. In addition to that, you're seen as something of an expert in areas of China and Chinese relations. Were you appointed to this role in the months run-up to the UNHRC sessions because you have sort of unique skills to be able to navigate these choppy waters, so to speak?
Well, I think the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been looking at what I was doing, especially during my time in the Navy, and I think especially so after my retirement in 2014, because I think I'm a bit of a unique character, because I went back to school at the retirement age. I started reading for my PhD on international relations, and I did it in 2015. I was awarded the first PhD. And then, of course, postdoctoral, I started talking and teaching and presenting various papers. So I would call my expertise is in international relations, but more to do with maritime security and strategic maritime consideration in the Indian Ocean. So I was not limited to China. I have been lecturing in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, and Japan. So these are the 5 countries that I have been working. And I was also writing a lot on various topics in the Indian Ocean, maritime security, the strategic consideration. And I was talking in many forums. I was getting invited for many forums. And I was also teaching here, international relations like conflict resolution in the Colombo University, Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, Bandaranaike International Diplomatic Training Institute, Kotlavali Defense University, Staff College. So it was, I think, quite a different role that I performed, especially after leaving the military service in 2014. So the President Rajapaksa, I'm sure he was monitoring what I was doing. And then he thought, okay, he's the best person at this juncture to carry forward the vision of the president and the government. Because, foreign relation is a tool to carry forward the vision of the government to the international arena. And I think he must have felt that we haven't done that sufficiently. Because, I have to tell you that this is the first time in Sri Lanka we have a president who was actually trained to do the job, because he 4 years and 4.5 years he was studying various aspects, he was traveling to various countries, and he had these academics joining him, the professional, so they were discussing all these aspects, and then they came out with the vistas of prosperity and splendor. Now in that, actually there are three pillars of the president's the vision. Number one is national security. Number two is economic development. Number three is foreign relations. So basically through foreign relations, how do we maintain national security and economic development of all people in the country? So then he would have thought, okay, so and so is the best person to do this job. And I carry a lot of experience as a practitioner on maritime security, maritime diplomacy, because I have done 36.5 years in the Navy, and I have traveled to about 47 countries as part of my naval training, naval exposure. And combining with my PhD and my teaching experience, my writing, presenting papers, I think I kind of established a mark in international relations, maritime strategy. And then, even when I was in the Navy, I was considered as somewhat a teacher, because I like to teach what I know. I believe in, transferring knowledge, empowering the young people. So when I was commander, I did many programs to empower the people. I introduced something similar to Toastmasters Club, where people, talk about a topic in various forums all over the country. And I used to write everything. And whenever I visited, I talk about how the country should be then. So therefore, I think the president thought, okay, he needs some fresh inputs to the foreign service. And he appointed me as his additional secretary for foreign relations in 2019 December, and in 2020 August he appointed me to be the foreign secretary. So I've been doing it. It's a very challenging job, but my expertise, my practitioner expertise, my exposure has really kind of groomed me to do this job. So here I am.
Actually, aside from the interview, I was just thinking when I met you also, you had a very professorial attitude to you, and I almost wanted to call you professor. So what you're saying makes sense.
Professor. Actually, I go as I'm the only admiral professor in this whole country.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. So no one has come to. I mean, of course, we have quite a few admirals. They have done great service.
Yeah.
And we have many professors. But admiral professor is the only me.
Okay, you were speaking about Japan, India, and other regional countries. Now, there has been some concern that with this East Container Terminal Agreement falling through, that India and Japan may not support us at the UNHRC sessions. Now, Japan is not a part of the 47.
Well, they are.
They are. Okay, and but India is,
very
and
much,
China last year became a member. We have Russia in there, and there's also Cuba.
Yep.
Cuba, we co-sponsored a resolution with, I think, in 2012.
Yep.
So are you confident that Sri Lanka has enough friends in the UNHRC to...
Well, to answer the question, you see the Human Rights Council has 47 members. And if you look at their composition, majority of them are the West oriented or coming from the global north, the political north, or they are allies, or they are, carrying their orders, right? So this is the reality in the Human Rights Council. So it is practically impossible for a small country like Sri Lanka to win 24 votes, right? So, I mean, this is the reality. We have to face it. And also, one thing that I have observed, because we have been analyzing what has happened since 2009 until 2021, the arguments, the ideology, the work done is not going to get you votes. It's the lobbying, it's the big powers lobbying is the determinant factor. So we are unfortunately facing something like that. But I think this year, 2021, we are in a much stronger position than before because we have, so-called many friends in the Human Rights Council. You mentioned China, Russia, and we hope, if you look at Japan, you asked specifically about Japan and India. Well, India at one point voted against us, and after that they abstained from voting. And Japan basically abstained from voting. So we need to understand the geopolitical reality of this. Japan and Korea are considered as Western allies in the East, right? Because they have large number of Western troops in their country. They are maintaining security. So they cannot just come to the Human Rights Council and say, oh, Sri Lanka has done well, so therefore we have to support you. It's difficult for them to make that decision because they are allies of some big powers. But then there are other countries, from the global south would say, no, these country-specific resolutions are wrong, right? The United Nations should be really supporting the countries to overcome the difficulties, not really be the arbitrator, not really be the global policeman. So there are countries. So we call them the like-minded group, LMG. So this year, we are really campaigning to get more LMGs, like-minded countries, to support us. You ask about India. Well, India hasn't told us anything yet, but we are hopeful that India, because India has a stated policy of neighborhood first.
Yes.
They have a stated policy of Sagar, that is security and growth for all in the region. And we have excellent relations between the two countries. Of course, when it came to the East Container Terminal, there was I think there is a, little bit of a heartache. So we had to correct that. You see, you mentioned about the East Container Terminal. This is something I feel personally, I'm representing my opinion. A country should undertake investment for economic reasons, majority, right? For the betterment of the country. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka does not have that luxury to make decisions based purely on economics. Why? Because we are so close to India, our biggest neighbor, and the central location of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean across the busiest world shipping route in the world, right? 50% of world containers, 35% of bulk cargo, nearly 72% of world energy pass every day just few nautical miles south of Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is actually the whole Indian Ocean. The pivot is Sri Lanka, the small country. So this geographical, geopolitical, geostrategical location of Sri Lanka, sometimes it's a blessing, sometimes it is a curse, right? Now, that is why I say, because the East Container Terminal, you see, look at the East Container Terminal. We have not been able to use the terminal for last 5 years. I think little more than 5 years, 600 meters of berth completed. Cranes have arrived, but we can't use our own port, right? So the previous government in 2019 signed an MOU that it will be given to India and Japan. Now the president came, he did not want to renegade on that. He said, no, the previous government, it's a government of Sri Lanka, has made a commitment. I will honor that. So he was determined to honor this MOU, and then he was working to that. But then the public opinion turned against it. The trade unions, the professionals, the Buddhist clergy especially, and they rallied around this thought that no, it should not be given to India. And then the president couldn't do it. Now people argue, I think, the people say that after president became, after Gotabaya Rajapaksa became president, he has gathered a lot of executive powers. No, it is not the case. There are many checks and balances because we have to go through the cabinet, there is a parliament, and the president is determined to go through the proper process. So he couldn't do it. And now we have offered the West Container Terminal. So India is not very comfortable because we have, backtrack on a promise that we have given. So we need to sort it out. And we are hoping, because there are 4 countries in this region, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, in the Human Rights Council. If we have solidarity in our region, I think that will send a very strong message. But if we cannot get that solidarity, our message will be weak, right? So we are doing it, we are campaigning, we are working very hard. The president is personally talking to almost all the ambassadors and high commissioners, and our missions in various capitals are doing their part, and we are writing all the letters, summaries. So we have a very good campaign going on. So we are not ready to surrender without a fight.
We're heading into difficult times or choppy waters, but we're not willing to surrender.
No, I'm a sailor.
Yes.
Calm waters will never make a good sailor.
Correct. Wise words.
Yes.
The United Nations Human Rights Commissioner is due to table her report, which has also already been out in the media. She's due to table her report this upcoming week. In it, she has said, and I quote, "The failure of Sri Lanka to address past violations has significantly heightened the risk of human rights violations being repeated." Now, I know Sri Lanka plans to reject these claims at the UNHRC sessions, but while you're still on the ground here, can you tell me what you have to say to this? Like, has Sri Lanka failed to
Well,
address?
yeah, we feel, Royal, that the High Commissioner's report is very damning and unfounded, not based on facts, and many of these are perceptions about Sri Lanka. It could be even it appears like a shadow reporting, done by someone in Sri Lanka, because they talk about various aspects which are purely internal domestic matters of a self-respecting sovereign country. I don't think a supranational body has that mandate. The UN mandate is very clear. Every country is equal. Every country is a sovereign, independent country. We are all members like that. So for UN to talk about Sri Lanka's internal domestic matter, let me share a few examples, or maybe you have listed few. They're talking about the 20th Amendment. Now we all know the 19th Amendment was done in a hurry in 2015, and what was the result? Utter chaos to the country. And what was the final result? 253 people dying on the Easter bombing. Why? Because the 19th Amendment created a division, power struggle between the president and the prime minister. And the worst affected area was national security, because they were not working together. Now that the Easter bombing report is due to be coming out, we will see what it contains. So we lost that. And that was the most deadly terrorist attack in Sri Lanka. Very innocent people who went to church to celebrate the rise of Jesus Christ were killed in an instant. Now that was a result of 19th Amendment. So President discussed about it and he wanted to amend it. And then after he became the president, when he wanted to amend the 20th Amendment, there were 32 cases went to the Supreme Court, and they ruled the Parliament has the right to go ahead with the 20th Amendment subjected to certain amendments. That is exactly what the president and the government did. And 2/3 of majority, 156 votes to be precise, was in favor of the 20th Amendment. So that means this is purely internal domestic matter of a country. Now, what right another institution has to say, oh, you have done this, why did you do it? Now, it's not like that. And then earlier I mentioned, the protection or the safeguards which the independent institutions like judiciary and various commission, they are still there. The 20th Amendment has not taken anything. Now, the 20th Amendment has not given supranatural powers to the president to, act on his individual. No, he's subjected to various protocols, various procedures in the country. And I think that's a good thing. But then look at our constitution, amended 20 times. So we need a good, realistic, understanding the ground reality constitution. And I think that process is taking place. So I just gave you one example. So therefore, we do not accept the report produced by the High Commissioner. Then let me also tell you another thing, Royal. You see, now this resolution that we are battling now, of course, originated somewhere in 2009, but culminated in 2015, when for the first time in the history of United Nations Human Rights Council, Sri Lanka went and co-sponsored a resolution against Sri Lanka. That first time, right? Now that actually took our friends by surprise. Oh my God, the country is saying, look, we have done something wrong. And it's like, the child goes to the principal and say, sir, I have done something wrong. Please don't punish me harshly. Something like that. But that really led to a situation. So look at the architects of the UN HRC Resolution 30/1, completely rejected by people. They are not even in the parliament system now. So that means there was a rejection of this act by the people of the country. And also, it was signed in 2015, 2018, the then Yahapalna unity government lost popularity. They lost the local government election. 2019, they lost the presidency. 2020, they lost the government. And with a two-third majority, a new government was established. I think one of the main reasons, among a few reasons, is of course our economy went on a slump, the bond scam, all that was there. I think one of the major reasons why the majority of people in this country voted for Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the government was because they felt that the previous government betrayed the country, surrendered the sovereignty. Because this, if you look at the 30/1, there are three things. One, you cannot do in accordance with the constitution of Sri Lanka. Two, many things we have done. Three, many things the people of this country do not want us to do. So we need to understand how democracy works. Now, democracy is people's power. Now, people of this country has given a very clear mandate that we do not subject ourselves to a supranational body like the UN Human Rights Council. And that is why in February this 2020, the Foreign Minister, Honorable Dinesh Gunawardena, went to Geneva and said, we are withdrawing from the co-sponsorship. Now the West is angry. They are angry for many reasons. They are angry because they wanted to stop the war during the final stages. But then our political leadership had the resolve to end terrorism, right? Imagine the situation, Royal, if the war was stopped prematurely in 2009, to date, there would be bombs going on in the country. To date, there will be violence in the country. Now, until 2009, May 19, per month, this country was losing something like 250 lives. Tamils, Sinhalese, LTTE, soldiers, Muslims, 250 valuable lives. From 2009, May 19, to date, zero. Now, what is important is that we have right to life here, right? First, you have to live to enjoy human rights. So, this is why I say the Human Rights Commissioner, and I think, let me stress another point. Now, actually, this report doesn't talk much about the war. It is only passing reference to the accountability, missing person, reparation. Now they are talking about this year. Last year, they say, oh, in Sri Lanka, there is a dangerous trend, right, with as far as human rights is concerned. And let me ask you, they have bracketed Sri Lanka among 9 countries. And what are these 9 countries? Nicaragua, Syria, Iran, Myanmar, Yemen, Venezuela, Belarus, North Korea, and Eritrea. Any student of world relations or international relations would say the 9 countries that I mentioned, there are civil wars, there are military rule, there are dictatorship. Is it same in Sri Lanka? Not at all. We have the last 2 elections were certified as free and fair election. When some very developed countries have issues with transition of power, Sri Lanka had smooth transition of power even in 2010, 2015, 2019 and 2020. So I think we are much, much more democratic than the 9 countries that I mentioned. And our human right is really enshrined and protected here. So we are not supposed to be in that bracket. So this is why I say the report we don't accept. We will battle on. We will indicate our concern logically with facts, factual errors, errors in law, errors in perception. These are the 3 areas that we are writing our reports. We have been doing it and we will continue to do that.
I also want to move to this government's continued stance on the UNHRC, what the UNHRC wants has been that it should not meddle in domestic accountability measures. But even previous governments have failed at establishing proper domestic, any kind of accountability or reconciliation measures. How does this government plan to do anything different?
Well, to answer your question, a government should be little more careful when making pledges to the international community. As I mentioned, the co-sponsor in the resolution 30/1, there were 3 areas. One, unconstitutional. So we can't do it. We can't have foreign judges in Sri Lanka, judging us. The second, the things we have done, I think that is what you are asking. The third, the people don't want us to do. Now, the then government started the Office of Missing Person, right, and started the Office of Reparation, and then, of course, there were other human rights council in Sri Lanka, then Office of National Unity and Reconciliation in Sri Lanka. They started something. And then they wanted to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act. They wanted to introduce a Counter-Terrorism Act. And they worked with Western countries to design a Counter-Terrorism Act. After 4 years deliberation, they themselves said this cannot be implemented. Imagine the situation if we had repealed the Prevention of Terrorism Act and Easter bombing happened, we would have been helpless. We would not have been able to tackle that issue effectively. So the point is, a government should make pledges only what the people will allow that government to do. Right now, getting back to the question, we want to continue with the Office of Missing Person. We want to continue with the Office of Reparation. We want to continue with all human rights institutions in the country. Not only continue, we want to empower them. We want to give them funding. We want to make appointments to various positions. Now, we have asked their action plan for 2021. Okay, what is your action plan? So we really want these institutions to function because that is a pledge we have made as a country. So we don't want to backtrack and say, okay, that was the previous government. No, it's not. As a government, we have pledged to the international community that we will find a solution on the case of accountability, on the case of missing person, right, on the case of atrocities committed allegedly, if some atrocities have been committed, and we are determined to continue those things. And in addition to that, it's a very important thing, the government has established another Presidential Commission of Inquiry with a Supreme Court judge. I think it's not nice to say the nationality, but he's a Muslim gentleman. He's a very well seasoned, experienced judge. And then there are two other people and a Tamil lady, a former mayoress of Jaffna. So ethnicity is there, the gender balance is there, and their mandate is to study all previous commission reports like Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, Paranagama Commission, even Darusman report, which we again don't accept, but to study, and then UN resolution, and to come out with a tangible, meaningful, measurable way of finding answers in a stipulated time period. This is not a commission which is appointed for years to buy time. They have been given a mandate. They have given a time period of 6 months, right? And I hope they will do a great job, and then we will be able to find solution to these issues. Now, the issue of accountability. The UN itself, they are flawed. One report says 70,000, and the same document in another place says 7,000, right? Now, we have to understand we were at a war. We were at a conflict. We were at a violent armed conflict. In a conflict, people died. But if 70,000 people died in the last phases of the war, where are the bodies? Where are the skeletons? None. So that means there had not been that many losses during the final stages of the war. And also we have to remember, the LTTE kept 300,000 people as a human shield, right? Now, on a particular day in 2009, the Colombo-based Western diplomats were taken to the Air Force Operation Room, and they were shown a live recording of an unmanned aerial vehicle hovering over Pudumatalan and Mullivaikal. What they saw, large number of Tamil people were trying to come out, and the LTTE was shooting at them. This is not what we say, this is what they saw. Right? So the LTTE was keeping them as a human shield, and they were firing at the army within that human shield, and the army had to really exercise restraint because they did not want to kill civilians, and their target was 0 casualties. That's a great ambition. And all these 300,000 people were rescued, and on that particular day, the government military forces completely changed their attitude. And on that particular day, because the army was fighting with the Tamil separatists, but they became the protector of these people. They were taken to various centers, they were well taken care of, they were given medicine, and after a lapse of few years, they were sent back to their homes, they were given jobs, some of them were rehabilitated. Now, the word on rehabilitation, 12,500 ex-LTT combatants either surrendered, discovered, or sent by their parents, oh, he's the LTT guy, rehabilitate him, were rehabilitated in Sri Lanka. To date, none of them went back to violence. What does that mean? We did not take these 12,500 to courts. We did not punish them. Instead, we taught them passion, love, peace, language, skills. Now they are doing very well, right? So where is human right violation in this? Why are we accused of violating human rights by this supranational body? I don't understand. We don't understand in Sri Lanka, and we feel it's not fair.
So if I were to take you to 4 very specific concerns that the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner has raised, and this is the militarization of civilian government functions. You spoke about the reversal of constitutional safeguards, surveillance and harassment of journalists, lawyers, civil society and activists, and the marginalization and exclusion of Tamil and Muslim minorities in the national vision and government policy. What would your rebuttal of?
Well, I would say, and then let me ask you a question. A retired military person, in Sri Lanka, we have voluntary service. No one is forced to join the military. They have joined the military on their own. And in the military, we retire pretty early, right? For a sailor, they retired at the age of like 44 years. And for an officer, mandatory requirement is 55. But some people retired even early. Now, what is wrong with the senior retired military officer being appointed to perform another function? Because he's still, so to say, young, and he has a wealth of experience. He's a disciplined soldier, and he brings a lot of leadership skills, and he has a lot of endurance, because you are trained to be having endurance in the military, right? So I think, and this is not the only country the retired military persons are appointed to high positions. Many countries do that. General Colin Powell of America, he was a general. Now he was appointed as Secretary of State. There's nothing wrong in it, right? So this militarization, I don't agree. I mean, in this report, there are 3 names mentioned. So let me explain one name, Minister Sarath Weerasekara. He retired, I think, about 15 years ago, and he contested parliament 3 times. First time from Ampara, he won. He became a parliamentarian. Second time he contested from Ampara, he lost. Third time he contested from Colombo, and he got the most number of preferential votes in Colombo. Now, is it wrong for him to be a minister? That is the people's choice, right? And then, of course, our army commander's name is mentioned. This president did not appoint this army commander. He was appointed by the previous government. This president only honored that commitment. Right? So therefore, this militarization doesn't hold any argument. The president is determined to change the country, make things happen. This is his slogan, make things happen. And if he finds that some things are not moving, because he has this belief that the senior military officers are able to perform job. Now, Royal, look at the COVID handling. Do you think if not for the army involvement, the Sri Lanka would be within the first 10 best countries of handling COVID? No way, right? So there is absolutely nothing to discuss about this one. And your second question is, again?
I think we talked about the constitutional safeguards, but we discussed that already, but perhaps surveillance and harassment.
Yeah, now surveillance and harassment. Now, you see, we neglected national security after 2015 brilliantly well. We dismantled all the intelligence agencies. We confiscated their files. We disbanded their camps, right? And we said the army military intelligence, don't do anything, right? Let the police only handle it. And what was the result, right? We didn't know until the Easter bombers, right? They had training, they had explosives, they had factories, and they had safe houses. We didn't know. And we received 92 warnings, and we didn't heed to them. What does that mean? That means we had a very lack or relaxed attitude to national security. We had completely broken down intelligence surveillance in this country. So do you want a similar thing to happen to Sri Lanka again? Answer is no. We don't want that to happen. We don't want people to die indiscriminately. And therefore, the president is giving high priority to national security. Now, some people who incite violence through new media, through social web paging, some people who want to divide the country, some people who want to incite in the minds of young people hatred and fight and violence, they are being caught, right? Because nowadays, you are not living in a watertight watertight compartment. The moment you are linked with WhatsApp, you are exposed, right? So technically, you can be tracked, right? These are the people that surveillance may have been carried out, taken to courts, punished or charged, right? It is not anyone else, right? I think Sri Lanka is quite a free country. Everywhere is free. But we need to pay attention to national security. If we do not pay attention to national security, we are doomed to fail once again. We have a lesson, 2019, and is the religious extremism dead in Sri Lanka? No, not at all. It is very much alive, right? Is the LTTE ideology of a separate state dead in Sri Lanka? Not at all. There are large groups of LTTE remnants. They want to separate the country again. They want violence again. They are calling people in Sri Lanka, okay, I'll give you $10,000, can you plant a bomb? Fortunately, not many takers. Fortunately, we know who's telling whom, right? So this is important for a country. Otherwise, there will be breaches of national security again. So we need to maintain surveillance in the country. And of course, you see, now, during the period leading up to 2009, did we have any control on the madrasas? Did we know what they were teaching? Did we know who were the preachers coming from which country and what were they preaching? We didn't know, right? So we need to find ways. Right now, if you take a Pirivana, you have a system. Your syllabus is approved by the Department of Education. If you take Daham Pasala should be a common thing. It's good to teach the religion to the young people, but then not extremist ideas. So if we don't watch them and allow anyone to do anything, we are doomed to fail.
Let's look at Sri Lanka in the larger picture. This pivot to Asia has been happening for a while now. But being as we are in Asia and you as Foreign Secretary, what do you think Sri Lanka needs to do? What allegiances, alliances and relationships does Sri Lanka need to build to fully make use of our position here now in Asia?
Yeah, as I mentioned little earlier as well, Sri Lanka is in the central location in the Indian Ocean. And we are neighbors to the biggest military power, economic power, population, that is India, in the Indian Ocean. And we are crossroads to maritime trade, maritime commerce. So therefore, we are in a critically geostrategically important location. So this location gives us advantage. Why? Because we can make use of the maritime trade to be the maritime hub of the region. But at the same time, this location attract unnecessary attention from the big powers. Now, if you look at the Indian Ocean, right now, it is the most militarized ocean in the world. Not Atlantic, not Pacific, the Indian Ocean, right? What does it mean? That means large number of warships, large number of submarines, and large number of military aircraft is in the Indian Ocean. What do they all want? They want to protect their shipping. They want to be here, right? So what we need is, we are very keen on maintaining the peace and stability of the Indian Ocean. And we want international rules-based maritime order in the Indian Ocean because we are a small country. Well, in maritime sense, we are very big. But size-wise, we are small, population small, economy small. But in strategic terms, we are a big power, right? Now, we have this unwarranted attraction to this country because every major player wants to have a foothold here. So how do we balance this attraction It's a fatal attraction. You know, it's although it is an attraction, it is a fatal attraction. Now, that is why the president has been very clear in his foreign policy. You ask about our role. He says, technically, we are a non-aligned country, perfectly all right, but we all know non-alignment movement was created after the World War II, and the world is very different to what it was then to now, but still we are technically. We want to maintain neutrality. That is the key foreign policy directive of the president and the government, maintain neutrality. We don't want to bandwagon with any major power. We don't want to take sides, one side against the other. We don't want to hedge one country against the other. We want to remain neutral. Whilst we remain neutral, we want to have economic engagements with all the countries to uplift the people, uplift the economic development of people. So these are very clear foreign policy directive. For the first time in our history, we have a written 20-point foreign policy directive for 2020 and beyond. First time in the country. So I'm very proud because I played a role in that with the presidents and the president's secretary, honorable minister and the team in the foreign ministry. This clearly state our foreign policy. So this is the challenge we have. How do we stay away from this major power competition? How do we benefit economically to our people in this major competition? If you look at the spheres of influence of these major powers, if you look at the axis of influence of these major powers, everything crisscross on Sri Lanka. So we have a huge task. How do we maintain balance on this? And the only way is to remain neutral. Because if we take one side, then again we are doomed to fail. So this is a very challenging job. I think so far we have been doing it very well. But also let me say that we are very conscious about India's strategic security concern. Now we don't want India to feel insecure because of Sri Lanka. So we don't want any country to use our territory or our sea to be a threat to India, because India is too big. India is our neighbor. We want to have good relations with India, but at the same time, we want to have good relations with China, Japan, America, EU, UK, South Korea, ASEAN countries, everyone, Russia. Right? One may think, what is the relation with Russia and the Indian Ocean? Russia is big time in the Indian Ocean. Right? So we need to maintain friendly relations and economic empowerment of our people. Because you see, we are going through a very difficult time economically because of the COVID pandemic. Of course, the whole world is going through a difficult time. We need to overcome this pandemic and we need to rebound on our economic development. The only way we can do is attracting foreign direct investment. To attract foreign direct investment, we need peace, we need stability, we need mechanism, we need procedures, we need laws. We need to be up on the ease of doing business, right, in order to attract foreign direct investment. For us, we need to be a producing country. You know, earlier we were importing everything and we were just doing little bit of business, bring something, add value, not even add value, add money and sell it. But no, we need to change from that import-dependent economy to export-oriented economy. We have to produce more. We have to produce more vegetables, fruits, because in the whole world, there is a requirement of vegetables and fruits. So we need to be a production-oriented country. We need to attract businesses. We need to attract foreign direct investment. And we need to create that environment which is conducive for that kind of a thing. And we can do it. I think we have the best advantage, and we have a stable government. We have a majority in the parliament. And I think that we all must. This is actually the time, Royal, that people of this country should forget the minor differences on based on ethnicity, based on political ideology, based on class ideology. This is the time the whole country should be united as one. They can have their political ideologies, but the need of the hour is to overcome the economic impact of the pandemic. Now, in that sense, you see, the UN Human Rights Commissioner is saying, oh, there should be targeted sanctions against this country. If there are economic sanctions against Sri Lanka, is it going to affect only one community? No, it will impact all Sri Lankans. So that is not what we need, right? So the reconciliation is a buzzword. I personally believe the reconciliation should evolve from us, evolve from our society, evolve from our community. Not someone point a gun at you and say, reconcile. It will never happen. It will only divide more people. This majoritarian discourse that we have had in the country after 2015 is because people felt that we betrayed the country. That is not what we want. We must forget about that. We must have one country, one people, and one nation.
Thank you very much, Admiral Columbage, and I wish you success going forward into a very challenging time with the UNHRC and also in your role as Foreign Secretary, because it seems, as you've explained now, there's lots of competing interests that you have to balance and manage with a vision in mind. So thank you very much for your time, and I wish you success.
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to share. Thank you.
Thank you.